Thank you for joining us on this wet and chilly Monday afternoon here in the DMV. Oh boy, it's highs in the 40s, lows in the 30s for the next few days. But enough about the weather. I will be your host and moderator. My name is Emmanuel Kim. I am the Korea Foundation Kim Renaud Associate Professor of Korean Literature and Culture Studies here in the East Asian Languages and Literatures at the George Washington University. And I want to welcome all of you to the nation's capital, especially our guest speaker today, Dennis Wuerthner, who is an assistant professor of East Asian Literatures at the Department of World Language and Literatures at Boston University. His main field of research is Korean literature, history, and culture in the broader East Asian context. He received his PhD from Ruhr University Bochum in pre-modern Korean literature, which he will be talking about today. He is the author of a study of hypertexts of Kǔmo, focusing on Guru and Gungi, and Tales of the Strange by the Korean Confucian monk Kǔmo by Kim Sisǔp. His new book, Poems and Stories for Overcoming Idleness, is a study of in-depth, full annotated translation of Panji, the earliest Korean work of Shua. And one of the oldest extant Korean sources has recently been published with the University of Hawaii Press. He is currently completing a book manuscript on insects in pre-modern Korean literature. Dr. Wuerthner will be talking about Kǔmo sinhwa as anti-yiduan propaganda fiction. Dr. Wuerthner, welcome to the nation's capital. Take it over. You have about 35 minutes of lecture, and we will open it up for discussion at the end. If you have any questions, please put your questions and comments in the chat box. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for the invitation, for the very kind introduction. Today I will be talking about Kǔmo sinhwa and Kim Sisǔp. And Kim Sisǔp was a major philosopher and also poet of the early Joseon dynasty, and arguably one of the most prolific, most multifaceted, but also enigmatic intellectuals of his time. While in pre-modern times, his memory and legacy defied reduction to a single label, since the beginning of the 20th century, his fame has solely rested on his work as a writer of narrative fiction, as today he is known for authoring Kǔmo sinhwa, a collection of 5 tales of ghosts and gods written in literary Sinitic. As a child prodigy who at the age of 5 was recognized by high-ranking scholars and also King Sejong on account of his remarkable literary capacities, Kim was a famous figure already during his own lifetime. He nevertheless did not hold office and had no political career. Astonishingly, in spite of his great talent, he is known to have failed the civil service examinations in 1453. For someone hailed as a Confucian Wunderkind since early youth, this must have been an absolute gut punch. And especially since all his friends passed the examinations with flying colors, his own failure must have left him disheartened and embarrassed. Autobiographical sources suggest that Kim hereafter slid into a serious mental health crisis, a depression that caused him to act in an erratic and antisocial, self-destructive manner. Importantly, following this personal fiasco, he turned his back on Confucian society. In later Confucian tradition, this radical step was hailed as an expression of protest vis-a-vis the so-proclaimed illegitimate usurpation of the throne by Sejong, and in loyalty to the first demoted and eventually even assassinated King Tanjong. Kim expressed his alleged protest in a highly unusual manner, for he forthwith declared himself a Buddhist, eventually spending almost the entire rest of his life roaming the Korean peninsula as a wayfaring monk in abject poverty under the Dharma name of Sǒljam. In the eyes of many conservative early Joseon Confucians, this was a radical step, because from a Confucian perspective, Buddhism at that point belonged to the so-called Yiduan, the unorthodox teachings of Buddhism, Taoism, shamanism. And centuries after his death, and especially during the late 18th century, Sǒljam Kim Sisǔp was reintegrated into the Confucian sphere by, for instance, posthumously being promoted to office, and his Buddhist life and identity were brushed aside. Yet the image of Kim as a Confucian in Buddhist disguise was already promoted by some of his 16th century biographers, such as Yulguk Yi, for example. And we can dismiss this as a blunt, state-driven attempt to seize interpretational control over his unique form of dissidence. But if we look at some of Kim Sisǔp's extant text in his collected writings, Meolangship, we find that these assertions were not entirely groundless. Although there are valid reasons to argue that the life and works of Sǒljam Kim Sisǔp reflect the productive hybridization of Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism, in some of his extant writings, Kim openly addresses his personal difficulties with these unorthodox teachings, and also the problematical circumstances under which he, for lack of better alternatives, I guess, came to enter the mountains and spend his life in religion and on the fringes. For instance, when living as a monk in the 1480s, in a letter to his benefactor, Yu Jia Han, Kim states that he never cared for the unorthodox teachings of Buddha and Lao Tzu, nor for having bald-headed monks as companions. Also, in a sacrificial text which is cited in the contemporaneous Sao Mengheng Nok by his friend Nam Hyo-on, Kim claims to have been misled by Buddhism in his youth, and laments that after having realized that in terms of deceitfulness and fabrication, there is nothing like samsara, he painfully had to admit to himself that he had squandered the prime years of his life. It appears that his struggle with Buddhist beliefs, practices, and institutions was a significant aspect of Kim Sisǔp's life. For instance, sources suggest that he not only looked critically at the feasibility and humaneness of the fundamental Buddhist prerogative of not killing animals, but also, for example, objected to the deeply rooted Buddhist funerary custom of cremation. This opposition to Buddhist rituals surrounding death is visible in a number of his surviving writings, including Kǔmo. It is particularly pronounced in the collection's fourth tale, Gazetteer of the Southern Continent Yombu, Namyombujuji, a story dealing with a conversation about religion, philosophy, and statecraft carried out between the human protagonist, Scholar Pak, who travels to the Buddhist underworld in a dream, and King Yama, the ruler of the dead. In this tale, Kim equates Buddhism with disorder and chaos, portraying it as equal to the story's overall setting, hell. Confucianism, on the other hand, stands for consistency and order. And in an ironic twist, this very notion is embodied by Yama, an originally Buddhist god, here flipped into a starch Confucian who belittles Gautama's teaching as wild words designed to control the inferior and stupid, who are, unlike Confucians, foolish enough to easily believe the cultish gibberish. Yama constantly negates core Buddhist beliefs and lambasts Buddhist traditions and rituals, especially those related to his own domain, and that's death. When their discussion touches on the subject of allegedly quasi-mandatory practices concerned with the dead in contemporaneous Joseon under Seiju's rule, Scholar Pak particularly criticizes the 49-day period in which the bereaved are to hold lavish rituals and make wasteful offerings to influence the process of the 10 underworld kings passing judgment on the departed soul. Hilariously, Yama, who is of course traditionally counted among these 10 Buddhist underworld rulers, at that point proclaims to have never even heard of any such kings. These Buddhist funerary rites, which became relevant only as late as the early Joseon, are in Scholar Pak's account portrayed as synonymous with indecent exposure, disrupting noise, pollution, and from a Confucian perspective, appallingly lewd disorder. The fictional passages from Namyon Bujuji can be brought in line, I think, with some of Kim's non-fictional writings. For instance, in his text On Funerals, Kim equally criticizes raucous, overcrowded Buddhist ceremonies for the dead, asking, how then could there be a commotion of bells, drums, and all sorts of symbols disturbing the soul as it is right by the morning sun's side? Next to funerary rites performed by the bereaved, in Kǔmo sinhwa, Kim also draws critical attention to heterodox burial practices. In the first tale, account of a Chokpo game at Mambok Temple, Mamboksa Toppugi, we find open criticism of the popular Buddhist burial procedure of kasa, meaning the process of first placing a corpse in a temporary grass or pit grave and later holding a secondary burial for the purified bones. In this tale, the female protagonist is the ghost of a young woman killed during the raids of the Wegu in late Goryeo. Due to the chaos of war, her parents were forced to perform the kasa practice and provisionally bury her in the mountains near a monastery called Buryansa. Her violent death notwithstanding, it is especially the temporary burial in the wilderness that causes her to be trapped in misery and in an intermediate sphere devoid of any meaning between our world and the dark realms. And it's only after the male protagonist, Scholar Yang, performs a secondary burial at the story's conclusion, an act infused with heterodox practices such as sacrificing animals and burning paper money, which Kim Sisǔp is known to have rejected himself, that she can complete her reincarnation and the overall process of rebirth. Notably, she is reborn as a boy in another country, signifying a complete severance of her ties to Scholar Yang, who is left in the end with absolutely nothing. In the second tale, biography of Scholar Yi, biography of Scholar Yi who peered over the wall, yet another Buddhist burial practice, while admittedly not explicitly written out, is at least alluded to. In a climactic scene in this story, the female protagonist, Miss Che, the virtuous daughter of a noble house and the faithful wife of the Confucian protagonist, Scholar Yi, is slain by a Chinese red turban warrior after having fought off a sexual assault by the foreign aggressor. She is thereby portrayed as a woman who, in accordance with ultra-conservative Neo-Confucian positions on the subject of female chastity, guards her integrity with death. After murdering the girl, the red turban rebel dismembers her body. This act of excessive killing is followed by the villain leaving her cut-up corpse at the scene of the slaying, exposing it to both elements and beasts. Importantly, it is not the heinous murder itself which later burdens the soul of Miss Che after her return from the dead into the arms of Scholar Yi, but the fact that her remains are yet unburied. Before she vanishes in the final scene, she implores her husband to have mercy on her soul and grant her a Confucian burial. What could have sparked Kim Sisǔp's intense focus on this aspect of her unburied remains? Here again, an anti-yiduan reading, I think, makes sense, for it seems plausible that Kim Sisǔp used the drastic post-mortem treatment of the body of Miss Che to critically hint at the Buddhist practice of the so-called wind burial. During this long-standing Buddhist funerary practice, the corpse was left at an isolated open place and covered with nothing but straw or twigs so that it would be exposed to the elements for the flesh to decay. Eventually, the purified bones were collected for a much later burial. For contemporary Confucian readers of the tale, particularly younger to middle-aged individuals who were likely still in the early stages of their own married lives, the repeated references to an exemplary wife's body parts being deliberately left to decay in the open for years on end would have been deeply disturbing, I think, if not to say appalling. And again, Kim's fictional and non-fictional writings can be brought in accord. for he treats this Buddhist burial process in his On Funerals as well, surely aiming to shock potentially older Confucian readers who are more likely to have personally experienced the death of a parent. Kim in On Funerals specifically speaks of a father's dead body being subject to the wind burial, thereby depicting Buddhists' ways as contravening the most fundamental human norms. Of course, Kim Sisǔp's literature and thought were deeply rooted in Chinese predecessors. In his non-fictional texts, anti-yiduan thought is time and again interwoven with the lives and writings of the preeminent thinkers of the formative period of Neo-Confucianism, the Northern Sung intellectuals Chen Hao and Chen Yi. Especially Chen Hao, who is known to have strayed from the Confucian way into Buddhism, but later returned to the Confucian fold and was eventually celebrated as an innovator and a true Confucian, seems to have served as a veritable role model for Kim Sisǔp in many respects. There are a number of texts dealing directly with Chen Hao in Kim's collected writings, such as the introduction to teacher Mingdao Zheng or the biography of Chen Hao. And in his introduction to teacher Mingdao Zheng, Kim portrays Zheng as a Confucian who had given himself away to the heterodox teachings with the explicit purpose of tackling it from inside, as an anti-Buddhist in disguise, who in a Buddhist-dominated age fought for the survival of Confucianism, or this culture of ours. During an age when educated Northern Sung elites were oftentimes enthusiasts of Chan Buddhism, the Zheng brothers considered Buddhism as a threat to state structures. Kim Sisǔp could have probably easily relate to these ideas because he lived during a time and in a political situation similar to that of the Zhengs, in a transitional period which occurred just a few decades after the dynastic change from Goryeo, which was a Buddhist dynasty, to Joseon. During this era, Buddhism still held a significant position in the socio-cultural landscape of Joseon, enjoying popularity and respect not only in the lower realms of society, but also among the upper classes and at the royal court. The full Neo-Confucian transformation of Korea was still hanging in the balance. And in this contested atmosphere, Kim Sisǔp may have been worried by the prospect of a political Buddhist renaissance. It is clear, of course, that in the 1450s and 60s, such fear of a Buddhist resurgence of the state at the state level was more justified than at any other point during the dynasty. For Sejul, who as an usurper king could hardly claim authority as a legitimate Confucian ruler in the Yao Shun tradition, openly favored Buddhism in the public and state domain. For someone like Kim Sisǔp, whose heart, as Yulguk Yi later famously stated, was Confucian, the danger of a complete Buddhist takeover must have felt imminent. Therefore, perhaps putting himself in an imagined line with Chen Hao, Kim seems to have taken the survival of this culture of ours as his personal responsibility as well, writing several pieces of non-fictional anti-yiduan polemics himself. One of these is his critique of the heterodox teachings, Yidangan, Kim's very own take on such Neo-Confucian anti-Buddhist model texts as the chapter on heterodox teachings from Jushi's Jinselu, or the section Critique to Expose Heterodox Teachings from the early Joseon statesman Jongdojeon's array of critiques of Buddhism. In line with these Chinese and Korean anti-Buddhist precursor works, Kim's anti-yiduan writings belong to genre of formalized theoretical texts and are geared towards older, higher up, more conservative groups of readers, highly trained in the reading of such treatises. However, as we can currently observe in an alarming magnitude, I think, around the globe, with politicians and ideologues increasingly targeting younger voters through media platforms popular in this age group, if political actors aim to gain power and influence, the future, influence the future of the state, they must effectively engage with and also win over the younger generation. And against this backdrop, I think it makes sense to assume that Kim likewise considered it imperative to find a way to drive home his message of Buddhism being unfit as a pillar of the state with younger Korean Confucian readers as well. In the scholarship, it has been shown that younger readers in early to mid-Joseon particularly enjoyed reading tales of the strange, such as Chiyo's popular collection, sinhwa. In mid-15th century Korea, these ghost story-loving Confucians, who were still striving for office and faced rather grim circumstances in a socio-political environment marked by a very rigorously selective civil service recruitment system and a chronically limited availability of official posts, for these people, quite possibly unsuccessful and therefore also in all likelihood unhappy readerships, the potential to be enticed by escape routes offered by a religion such as Buddhism, which has a focus not on this world, but the next world, was particularly high. And Kim discusses this issue actually in his critique of the heterodox teaching in his Idanbyeon, writing, if there is an attained Confucian man who exhausts principle by studying and fulfilling nature and who rejects Buddhism's outlandishness, he will not drown therein. Yet if there is an attained Confucian man or high-minded scholar who actually does drown therein, it may have happened out of unhappiness. But this unhappiness, what could it have derived from? Confucians may throw themselves into the unorthodox teachings because the country is in peril or their bodies are worn out, because their ambition is great but their talents meager, because the personal situation is dire or the state of affairs is desperate, because their spirit and principles have become listless, because they were banished or are living in anger and regret. All of this can make a high-minded, enlightened Confucian act this way and turn to Buddhism. Similarly, in his introduction to teacher Mingdao Cheng, Kim writes, "Without true Confucians, all under heaven will be thrown into chaos, for there will be no one left who knows anything about the practice of good government anymore." Ergo, in Kim's mind, the exodus of unhappy Confucians into seemingly soothing Buddhism needed to be stopped for the sake of a functioning state. Viewed in the framework of Kǔmo Shinha, this figure of the wavering, unhappy Confucian is embodied perfectly, I think, by scholar Pak from Namyeon Bujuti. At the beginning, he appears as an eager, self-confident, yet entirely unsuccessful scholar who is on the verge of succumbing into the unorthodox teachings himself. In the human world, he is under the influence of Buddhist acquaintances and even writes a Neo-Confucian manifesto in which he stresses the role of Li, so principle, in guiding and serving as the root for all things, and criticizes the Buddhist idea of two levels of reality, to convince himself to not be won over by his Buddhist friends' ideas of karma or their flamboyant stories of ghosts and spirits, heavenly halls, and earthen purgatories. Only when he awakes in the southern continent of floating blazes, meets King Yama, and actually gets to directly experience a realm under Buddhist dominion, does he fully understand and grasp what a fiery hellhole of anarchy would open up if the Buddhists were actually in charge. Pak is finally saved by the core Confucian Yama, and in the end, tellingly, is even enthroned as the next king of hell, becoming Yama's Confucian successor to bring the Buddhist sphere in line. The male characters from the other four tales, however, are not quite so lucky, for they meet the real representatives of Buddhism and Taoism in their respective netherworld narratives. At first, these men are aspiring young model Confucians who study hard to become productive members of the government and the society. But once they come into contact with the supernatural religious realm, their intellects, spirits, and judgments are corrupted or deadened by empty pleasures or flattery. Scholar Yang in Manbuksatopuli, for instance, meets ghosts who bewitch his senses with sexual flirtations. One could argue that in the unnatural realm, the main female ghost casts an abnormal erotic spell over him. And if interpreted in this way, even the somewhat puzzling, in terms of plot development, rather unfitting appearance of the four neighboring ladies begins to make sense, because their farewell poems are also marked by a wealth of openly wooing sexual innuendos, making the unmarried, sexually unfulfilled scholar's head spin. In the end, however, the realm of strange phenomena and ghosts is insubstantial and fleeting, and he cannot stay there. But after Scholar Young's return to the real world, he's also lost to regular Confucian society, and therefore has no other choice but to abandon everything and retreat into the mountains. The same holds true for Scholar Han from the final tale, who is drawn into the supernatural realm through flattery and praise of his alleged literary abilities by the Dragon King, a guardian deity in Buddhism. After inevitably having returned to the human world, he too must vanish into the mountains. And these endings are generic to a certain extent, but in my mind, I think they do contain sharp criticism directed at those who succeed in turning young Confucians. In the second and third tale, the male protagonists are neither frustrated nor failed scholars, but rather vivacious young men with a lust for life and learning. Yet even they are not immune to the disease that is religion, for after having come into contact with beings from a Taoist sphere, they both become sick, first losing their minds and then losing their lives. For them, the encounter with the transcendental ends not merely in social irrelevance, but madness and actual death. In conclusion, I think it is possible to view Kǔmo sinhwa as a piece of narrative anti-religious propaganda fiction, an agenda-driven work of persuasion meant to manipulate sentiments and opinions, as a piece of narrative literature geared towards producing an emotional response in a very specific group of younger contemporaneous readers who were to recognize themselves in the tale's literati protagonists and be appalled by the narrative depiction of heterodox practices and ideas described therein. I think it can be hypothesized that the intended young Confucian readers were to be put off by the narrative depiction of such things as heterodox funerary and burial practices, the slaying of virtuous wives, the lavish materialness of Buddhist worship and the clergy's demand for worldly riches, the moral contamination and social exclusion of once ambitious scholars, or the idea that religion constitutes a disease that cannot be cured and eventually leads to death. Through the connection of the fictional narrative with the intended reader's own reality, as well as the ensuing response of aversion towards the non-Confucian, Kǔmo sinhwa may be hypothesized to have been designed to build readership consensus after cultivating an emotional understanding of the negative effects for both the individual as well as the state if Confucians turn to religion. And importantly, the work is here theorized to have been designed as propaganda for Confucian readers of fiction, not as agitation for Buddhist readers who needed to be persuaded to defect to the Confucian side. For, as Philip Taylor argues, propaganda is most effective when it preaches to the already converted. The fact that Kǔmo sinhwa apparently never caused Kim Sisǔp or anyone who later transmitted the text any trouble from the higher-up authorities, and also that the work was later printed and even officially endorsed, also I think may support this interpretation. Generally, Kim Sisǔp's anti-Buddhist polemics were firmly rooted in the tradition of earlier Chinese and Korean incendiary anti-religious writings by Neo-Confucian thinkers. Yet, while the brothers Cheng, Zhu or late Goryeo early Joseon academicians such as Chung Do-jeon stuck to formalized theoretical texts designed for those highly trained in such philosophical historiographical debates, Kim Sisǔp's approach appears broader, more innovative, and geared towards a more expansive target audience than that of his precursors. For the history of Korean literature and the narrative of its single linear teleology, his decision to create the one work which is today widely considered to have marked the beginning of classical fiction in Korea is naturally of tremendous importance. Yet Kǔmo sinhwa has always stood somewhat alone, as is indicated, for example, by the work not being included in Kim's collected writings until modernity. For sure, its indisputable indebtedness to Jianning Sinhwa was unavoidably already broadly acknowledged during pre-modern times. But aside from this, since its reintroduction into Korea in the early 20th century, Kǔmo sinhwa has generally been regarded as one visionary genius's unique literary invention. Rarely has it been considered as part of a network of interlinked texts by the same author, or as the continuation of an active East Asian or Korean movement and school of thought. If, however, the five tales are placed in line with other works from Kim's oeuvre, such as the essentially content-related critique of heterodox teachings, on funerals, or introduction to teacher Ming Dao Cheng, Kǔmo sinhwa does not appear as a singular, detached literary phenomenon anymore, but rather a natural next step in Kim's endeavor to influence very specific readership and carry on very specific traditions. And there could, we could find here, I think, a possible answer to the pressing question as to why Kim Sisǔp chose to write a piece of narrative fiction in the first place. Kim was intimately familiar with Chinese works of prose fiction, and he had personally experienced the power that storytelling can have on readers. In the final lines of his poem, inscribed at the end of Jianning Sinhwa, a piece of literary criticism in verse on the content, meaning, and impact of Jianning Sinhwa, Kim exclaims, "To read just one tale is sufficient for me to laughingly open my teeth, and swept away are the lumps of sorrow in my breast that had been there for my entire life." Kim understood how stories can visualize and make tangible abstract issues and ideas, how they have the power to rouse to action or to dissuade. His role as an innovator of Korean literature could consequently be found in his recognition of the potential of fictional storytelling and his literary ability to transform Chinese source materials in such a way as to make it meaningful and impactful for a mid-15th century Korean reading situation. And there could not have been a better author for this kind of targeted anti-religious propaganda, because Kim possessed a level of both fame and credibility like no other. As a Confucian prodigy who had experienced personal failure at the most important stage of a young Confucian's life, had thrown himself into religion and come to regret his decision, Kim was in a unique position to underpin this anti-Buddhist literary propaganda with his very own personal story. This is, of course, not to say that Sǒljam Kim Sisǔp was not an exceptionally knowledgeable, influential Buddhist thinker who had a very innovative approach with regard to such things as Haom or the meditation school. But in terms of his views concerning the danger of a revival of Buddhism as a state religion in this transitional age, I think that the 5 short stories in Kǔmo sinhwa speak volumes. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wuerthner. Yes. Celeste, did you have your hand up?
Thank you very much. If there are questions, Manuel, you can go first, or take some from the Q&A. But it was a fascinating talk. Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. Yes. All right. I do have a few questions, but it's mainly out of ignorance. Perhaps, if you could, can you briefly, very briefly, tell us the Kim Sisǔp's um, it's a tale. You call it the new fiction, the new tale of the golden turtle.
Yes.
Yes, yes. Can you briefly tell us that synopsis of that tale?
Okay, so Kǔmo sinhwa is a collection of 5 tales. The title of that collection is Kǔmo sinhwa. There are different theories regarding the title. New Tales, that is, the sinhwa probably refers to the model work, the Jianding Sinhwa by Qiyou, which I mentioned earlier, which is a Chinese ghost story collection, early Ming Dynasty, which was very popular in Korea. It was indexed in Ming Dynasty China for about 40 years, but still it entered Korea. And as we can see, as we saw earlier through this poem written at the end onto the last page of Jianding Sinhwa by Kim Sisǔp, he had access to this collection and he liked it a lot. He was strongly influenced by it, and I think he understood the power of storytelling and what stories can do to readers, because this was so very popular. So he modeled his own collection of tales onto this Chinese collection, which was circulating in Korea, and it's a collection of 5 tales. The first one is called Manbuksa Chopugi, which, as I said, is a ghost wife tale. Scholar Young falling in love with a ghost, and then he is very dissatisfied. He longs for a partner, and he has this wager with the Buddha. He plays a game with the Buddha and says, if I win, you send me a really nice girl. And if I lose, I'll do something for you. I'll open a Dharma ceremony for you. Of course he wins, and the Buddha sends him a girl, but what he doesn't know is that the girl's actually dead already, and that it's the ghost of a girl who died years and years ago. And so that's the plot of the first one. The second one is also it's a little different. It's also a ghost wife tale, but it's the tale of two characters that they are from different social strata. She is from a very rich family. He is a scholar, a literatus, but still going to university, to the National Academy. And they fall in love, and they in the end they get together, they marry, and then she's killed. And she comes back. She's actually sent back to him by the Jade Emperor, the highest deity in religious Taoism. And that's also important, I think. So he becomes sick in the end because he dies in the end of a broken heart, so to speak, because he can't let her go. And the Jade Emperor is actually responsible for that in the end. Yeah, and so it's these 5 tales basically. They were read and circulated in 15th century, 16th century Korea. Many of the major intellectuals and literati of the time read them, but then the collection is lost in Korea during the Injin-Uera and the Hideyoshi invasions. It reappears in Japan, so it was brought to Japan, and there it was very popular. It was printed 3 times in the 17th century, had strong influence on Japanese ghost story collections, such as Otogiboko, for example. The first tale from Otogiboko is a 1-to-1 copy, basically, of the 5th tale from Kǔmo sinhwa. And it's just, the setting is Japanese and the characters have Japanese names, but the rest is, and there's not so much poetry. It's waka poetry in there, not literary, not shi, right? Yeah. But it was very popular, and it was last printed in Japan in 1884 in a version, a commented version where Japanese scholars wrote annotations, and this version was discovered by Chen Namsan at the beginning. When Chen Namsan was at Waseda University, he discovered this and brought it back, and is the first to have written on it.
This was during the colonial period.
During the colonial period, yes.
Yeah.
So it came back, and then from this time on, it has become one of the core works of the national Korean canon of literature.
Right.
And, one of these great works that, if you look at the history of reception, it's always sort of like, understood as this singular work somehow, right? It doesn't really fit with the rest, at least at first glance, with the rest that Kim Sisǔp wrote. But if you really look at what he wrote about things such as religion, and you can find a lot of parallels between his non-fictional writings and his fictional writings. Yeah, so that is.
Yes. So in terms of form and content, what did the Kǔmo look like in terms of form?
It's a woodblock print. So the oldest version that we have is Yun Chunyan's. It was put together by Yun Chunyan in the middle of the 16th century, and we have a biography of Kim Sisǔp, the Maewolgang Samsaengjeon, at the beginning of this oldest extant version, plus a poem that Kim Sisǔp wrote, Seo Kapjipu, written at the end of the first edition of Kǔmo. So that came out in the middle of the 16th century, and that's the version that's a state-sponsored woodblock print edition. That's what I meant earlier with, the state they invested in this piece, and they thought it was good for them somehow. So that also, I think, underpins and substantiates the idea that in 16th century Korea, Chosun Korea, Buddhism was strongly being marginalized already at this point. During Kim Sisǔp's lifetime, that is different. But in the 16th century, it's moving towards a strong Neo-Confucian society, and Buddhism is being pushed into the mountains. Basically, still exists, of course, but not in the capital anymore. It's being pushed into the mountains, so to speak, right? So, and if you understand the way that I understand Kǔmo now as basically an anti-yiduan piece, an anti-Buddhist piece, that perfectly fits into the mindset of the 16th century court, so to speak, right? So that I think makes a lot of sense. And this oldest version was actually only discovered by Professor Cheung-chul in 1999 in China. So that's the oldest version that we have. Yeah.
Right.
It definitely circulated in handwritten manuscript form also, but before that.
So I'm going to ask one more question, a follow-up question to my previous question. The reason I ask about the form and content is it according to your lecture, it sounded like Buddhism was more free, was more unrestrained. However, Confucianism or Neo-Confucianism is a lot more structured. It's not chaotic, as you mentioned in your lecture. So I was wondering if the prose itself of these 5 tales were structured in a way that is neatly packed like a Confucian scholar, or was it free-flowing? Was it organic, like one would think of a Buddhist?
That is a very, very good question. Very difficult to answer. There's a lot of poetry in there in the collection. So free flowing, no, I would say it's not all that free flowing, and I'm not sure if that's actually what Buddhism is free flowing. I'm really not sure about that. But we have Neo-Confucian manifestos, so to speak, in this collection, in the 4th tale especially, which is a mundap, so a question-answer conversation between the scholar and the Buddhist king about Confucianism and Buddhism. And the Buddhist king, Yama, a god, in the end convinces the human scholar that Confucianism is the better answer for the state, so to speak. But there we do have actual treatises, so to speak, Neo-Confucian works interwoven into the plot. That we do have there, yeah. But other than that, it's quite tight text. It's not long either.
Right.
And with all the poetry in there, of course, in pre-modern times, narrative fiction, works of narrative fiction and prose were looked down upon a lot by the literati in
Right.
Korea because it's poetry, right? I mean, the main
Genre and art form, right?
genre is poetry, right? So
Yeah.
so he put a lot of poetry in there as well in order to, I think, somehow make it interesting for readers during his time and show them that he was a great writer, although he wrote prose.
Yes.
Yeah, fiction.
Interesting.
There's
Yes.
still all this poetry in there, yeah, to tell.
Celeste, you had a question.
Thanks very much. So as a political scientist, I'm very curious about the state that you talk about and the officials behind the propaganda. And so I wonder if you could like clarify for me a little bit how much Kim Sisǔp's intention was to turn people away from Buddhism versus posthumously the state kind of inscribed that intent onto his work. And if you have any official documents, say from the 15th century, that are trying to sort of incorporate him back into the fold for official purposes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yes, there was this great drive and project, so to speak, later on, especially in the 18th century, to bring him back into the Confucian fold. A person who never held office throughout his entire life. Confucians are supposed to work for society, right? That's their obligation. And he never did that. He ran away from this, so to speak, right? And it was his behavior and his conduct was reinterpreted in later times. They said, the Confucians, Neo-Confucians who ran the state in the 17th, 18th century, they said he did this on purpose to undermine the government, so to speak, because he rejected the Buddhist king of his time. And the only way out of the system was to become a Buddhist wayfaring monk and go into the mountains and live away from society, only in the mountains, so to speak. So he was basically forced to do this, although he was not a Buddhist believer. That's what they later on said. And he became the object of worship in Confucian shrines, for example. He was posthumously given office. He was brought into these high offices, and during that time, I mean, his Buddhist identity were basically brushed aside. But Kim Sisǔp himself, in his writing also, is really a hybrid figure. He grew up during a time, as I said, which was a transitional period. Confucianism was becoming much stronger, but Buddhism was deeply rooted in Korean society at that point. Buddha dynasty was a Buddhist dynasty, and many of these traditions were still around. And Kim Sisǔp also received a Buddhist education. So I think he was only able to actually become a monk because he had received that Buddhist education. In later times, in the 17th, 18th century, that would not have been possible for a Confucian scholar who actually sat for the civil service examinations and failed them, okay, but still, who sat for them, to actually turn around and say, well, I'm a Buddhist monk from now on, right? Because they never, in the 18th century, they just did not, I think, did not have that groundwork. He did have that foundation, so he could go into Buddhism, and he was a Buddhist. He was not a straightforward Confucian. He also wrote a lot about Taoism, for example. So he had all these different fields that he was interested in and that he was very well versed in. And he was at the time acknowledged by his contemporaneous, by the people who lived around him, and the monks and the clergy of that time, as one of the leading figures in Korean Buddhism and one of the most influential and innovative thinkers in Korean Buddhism. So when, for example, they had these great Dharma ceremonies at Seju's court, all the other monks said, we cannot have anything like this without Sǒljam being here. So we have to bring Sǒljam here because he is the brightest of all of us, basically. So he was definitely a Buddhist and wrote a lot about Buddhist theories and so forth. But when it comes to the state, the way in which the country was run, I think he had this he had very strong opinions about this, that Buddhists should not be at the center of this. And that's, you do see this in his non-fictional writings, and the way in which I read Kǔmo, I think you can read it that way as well.
We have a question from, I believe, Professor Cho, if I'm not mistaken. The question is, if Kǔmo sinhwa, you can see this in your Q&A box, you can pull it up.
Oh, over there it is, okay.
If Kǔmo sinhwa can be characterized as propaganda fiction with the desire to use the power of narrative against Buddhism, how artful would you judge those tales to be? It seems that the Buddhist-based tales of the strange are thought to be artful tales that lead people astray from Confucianism. And so the power of fiction is recognized. If Kim Sisǔp is successful in using narrative against the Buddhism, or Kim Sisǔp successful in using the narrative against Buddhism, in your opinion?
I think he is successful. Artful, I would call it artful. Yes, of course. He was a great writer. He was seen at the time as one of the greatest writers of his time. And with all the poetry also in there, it is quite artful. Then again, I do think it is a successful, is a very sublime, very very intricate kind of way of manipulating readerships, right? And thereby, I do think it is quite successful in bringing out this aversion, I think, to the way in which Buddhist funerals were, for example, conducted, or to somehow incite a readership. With that, I think it is quite successful. Yes, and
then she asks the following question: is Kǔmo sinhwa in its own category? Has there been a follow-up tradition of Confucian fiction after Kǔmo sinhwa?
Not really. Not really. I mean, it hardly ever brought out any hypertexts, any adaptations afterwards. So we do find little snippets of it. For example, in Kǔmo, I think, but that's very late, so it's very difficult to actually prove that Kim Manjung, the author of Kǔmo, actually had access to Kǔmo sinhwa, because probably it was already lost at that point, but still some snippets of the plot or some things were probably still circulating at that point in time. But there is not a long tradition of Chonggi based on Kǔmo sinhwa later on. There is in Japan, but to the best of my knowledge, not in Korea. And that's the same today, pretty much. I mean, this is not a work which brings forth all sorts of adaptations, so to speak, right? So we do have that in the case of Kǔmo or other works, Journey to the West, and there's great scholarship on this. But in the case of Kǔmo sinhwa, not really. There's not, no follow-up works.
Interesting. And then Kishra asks, did Confucian scholars read these tales? If so, what was their reaction? And I'm going to add to that question. Not only was it read, was it orally transmitted as well? People talking about it, people adding to these tales and elaborating on these tales. Because it went to Japan and then it came back. Was there an addition? Was there minus additional stuff, or subtracting, detracting? I mean, was there any kind of transformation of these tales?
No, not at all. They're always the same, always in the same order. Also, the Japanese prints, woodblock prints, are all in the same order, these 5 tales. Confucian scholars, yes, I think so. I think it is, the work is actually written for young Confucian scholars, right? That's in order to influence them, basically, right? So I do think there's no textual evidence for this, but just on the basis of Kǔmo itself, I think we can say that this is meant for young Confucian readers to influence them in a certain way. At least that's the way I enter. There are other interpretations, of course, but this is the way I understand it. And even in the 20th century, we hardly have any alterations at all. So the only example that I can name is a North Korean translation of the work from 1963, where the third tale is excluded. That is because the third tale takes place in Pyongyang, and the female protagonist is a Taoist immortal who is somebody related to Kija. And yeah, since Kija, the Kija 동네설 is not something that is that is permissible in North Korea, at least not at that point. Yeah, it is excluded. But that's the only work I know where actually somebody tried to do something with the text.
Propaganda to promote the state.
Yeah, you can maybe read it that way. Yes,
yes,
exclusion, so to speak. Yeah, but then again, there's a retranslation, or it was reissued, that 1963 translation in 1990, and they put the story back in. So it popped back up.
Very interesting.
Without the introduction where the Kija 동네설 is actually explained. That is thing. But yeah.
It's a fascinating country. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Wuerthner. We're going to end it here. Perfect timing. Hit the 2:00 time right now. And this will conclude our Premodern Lecture Series for this year. Join us again in the fall, where we will continue with our Premodern Lecture Series. And for those who are dying for another GWIX event, this Friday, April 11th, we will have Disability Rights in East Asia's Democracies 2025. This is our GWIX signature conference. If you haven't RSVP'd for this, please register now. We still have a lot of space, I believe. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again. Bye-bye, everyone.